Man of God, let me ask you a real question. Have you ever sat in your car for just a little too long before you walk into the house? Not because you're late, not because you forgot something, but because you're tired, not physically tired, but just mentally tired. You got work pressure, you got financial pressure, you got parenting pressure, and somehow now you also have marriage pressure. You love your wife so much. You're committed. You're not going anywhere, but the stress is so loud. And nobody really taught us how, as men, nobody really taught us how to deal with that. Today, I want to help you overcome marriage stress God's way, not by running, not by shutting down, not by pretending everything is just fine, but by stepping into the leadership role that God already designed for you. You know, stress isn't the enemy, silence is. Let's get this straight. Stress in marriage is normal, silence in marriage is dangerous. Most men don't leave marriages, they retreat inside of them. We stop talking, we stop sharing, we stop engaging. And we tell ourselves, if I just keep my head down, it'll blow over. But as we look at Proverbs 18, it reminds us death and life are in the power of the tongue. What we don't say can hurt just as much as what we do say. I've talked to countless men who say this. I don't want to make things worse. But, brother, avoiding the conversation doesn't make you peaceful, it makes you passive. And passivity is not biblical masculinity. I've been in your situation before where I've had to wait in the car before I went in the house, or I'd have to go for a drive just to get ready for the stress that was about to happen. Trust me, all men, we've gone through this and we will continue to go through this, but we have to deal with these things God's way. You know, Jesus didn't avoid pressure, he faced it with purpose. Let's look at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. In Matthew 26, it tells us clearly this: my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That's stress. That is pressure. That's emotional weight right there. But what did Jesus do? He did not isolate. He didn't pretend. He didn't explode. He prayed. He prayed, he processed, and he pressed forward. Jesus shows us something very powerful here. Feeling pressure doesn't mean you're weak. Let me say that again. Feeling pressure doesn't mean you're weak. Refusing to face it does. God never called you to be emotionless. He called you to be anchored and anchored in Him. So, why does marriage stress hit men differently? Here's the truth most men won't say out loud. When marriage gets stressful, men, we feel like we're failing. We're failing at the assignment. We measure ourselves by provision, by protection, by stability, and by respect. So when the relationship feels tense, when it feels disconnected or strained, it hits our identity, not just our emotion. That's why we as men shut down instead of opening up. That's why we go quiet instead of vulnerable. That's why we distract ourselves with work, with hobbies, with phones, or being busy. Ephesians 5 and 25 says this: husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That kind of love requires presence, not perfection. Let me say it again. That type of love requires your presence, not perfection. So let me give you three biblical shifts to overcome marriage stress. The first one is this: lead with curiosity, not with control. Most arguments aren't about the issue, they're about feeling unheard. James 1 and 19 tells us, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Men, this is not weakness. Listening is not a weakness. This is wisdom. Instead of asking, why are you upset? I've done this before. Babe, why are you so upset? Try this instead. Help me understand what you're feeling. That has a much softer tone. Curiosity disarms conflict. Control is going to escalate it. Shift number 2 is this: replace assumptions with conversations. Stress grows in the gaps of assumption. We assume she knows I'm trying. We assume she knows I love her. We assume she knows I'm under pressure. But love unspoken becomes love unfelt. Proverbs 27 tells us, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Sharpening requires friction, but intentional friction. Healthy conversations now prevent explosive arguments later on. Let me say it again. The healthy conversations you have now are going to prevent big explosions and arguments later on. Shift number 3 is this: bring stress to God before bringing it to your wife. Your wife is your partner, not your savior. Psalm 55 says this: cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. When men don't process stress with God, we leak it everywhere else. It comes out in our tone, in our attitude, in our silence, in our distance. I know that my wife can attest to this because she has mentioned to me about my tone and that silence and the distance as well. Prayer doesn't remove this responsibility, it restores perspective. I remember talking to a man who said this: we don't fight, but we don't connect either. That is not peace. That's emotional ceasefire. When he finally slowed down and said to his wife, I've been stressed and I didn't want to burden you, but I ended up pushing you away. When he finally said that, when we will finally say that to our wives, that we're stressed and we don't want to burden them, and that we end up pushing them away, when we say that finally to our wives, everything is going to shift. Now, it's not going to shift overnight. It's not going to shift magically, but it's going to shift honestly. Men don't need to have all the answers. Let me say it again. Men, you do not need to have all the answers. You need to have the courage to start these conversations. That is what's going to make a difference. Brother, marriage stress doesn't mean your marriage is broken. It means it's asking for leadership, not loud leadership, not perfect leadership, but present Christ-centered leadership. You don't overcome marriage stress by checking out. You overcome it by leaning in with God first and your wife second. Psalm 127 says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Let God build. You just show up. Brother, if this message hit home, I want to invite you to take one simple step further. Join our free 7-day marriage challenge for Christian men. No fluff, no judgment, just biblical truth, practical steps, and real growth. The link is in the description below. And if you're watching this video, comment below, I'm choosing to lead, because leadership starts with a decision.